Ridge Hill was a place people avoided, especially when the monsoons hit. The heavy, unrelenting rain would turn the dirt roads into rivers of muck, and the wind howled through the towering trees like a warning. But it wasn't just the storm that made people steer clear of the old mansion. It was the stories that lingered like fog around Ridge Hill, stories that had kept the mansion abandoned for over 70 years. The mansion itself stood as a decaying reminder of what had once been. Broken windows, a sagging roof, and doors that hung by a single hinge. It was a place that smelled of rot, both from the wood and the legends tied to it. They said you could hear voices, moans, screams, and the faint lullaby of a child from the upper floors, even though the roof had collapsed long ago. Locals whispered about the mansion, cautioning anyone who dared to even look in its direction. But to Matt, Erica, and Chloe, the stories seemed too ridiculous to be taken seriously. They were college students, full of youthful curiosity and a thirst for adventure, and they weren't about to let an old house and a few ghost stories scare them away. It was the middle of the semester, and the monsoon season had begun in full force. The air was thick with moisture, and dark clouds rolled in, as if the heavens themselves were about to crack open. The three friends had heard the rumors, of course, but they were determined to investigate for themselves. They needed something to break the monotony of their usual college routine. And what better way to do that than exploring an abandoned mansion? "Are you sure about this?" Erica asked, her voice shaky as she adjusted the flashlight in her hand. The rain fell in torrents around them, splashing against the worn path leading up to the mansion. She could barely see a few feet ahead, but the looming silhouette of the house was enough to send a shiver up her spine. Matt, the braver of the three, grinned back at her. "Don't worry, it's just a house. How scary can it be?" Chloe laughed nervously, clutching her jacket around her shoulders. "Yeah, if we make it out alive, we'll have the best story ever." Despite their nerves, the trio pressed forward. The mansion grew larger as they got closer, the windows broken and gaping like empty eye sockets in a skull. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind as if it were waiting for them. "You guys hear that?" Chloe asked, her eyes darting around. "I think it's just the wind," Matt said, though his voice faltered as he stepped onto the porch. He had heard it too. A soft, mournful sound, like a woman crying. "Maybe we should just go back," Erica said, stepping back, but it was too late. The door had already closed behind them with a soft thud, sealing them inside. The moment they entered, the air grew colder, and the smell of mildew and rotting wood assaulted their senses. The hallway stretched out in front of them, dark and foreboding. A staircase loomed in the distance, its wooden steps warped and cracked. Dust hung in the air, and the occasional thunderclap sent echoes through the house, amplifying the eerie silence that clung to the place. "Let's split up," Matt suggested, excitement and a hint of nervousness in his voice. "We'll cover more ground that way." Chloe and Erica exchanged uneasy glances, but agreed. They all knew the stories, but in the back of their minds, they all secretly believed it was just superstition. As they ventured further into the mansion, the storm outside raged on, and the wind began to howl through the broken windows. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of the storm, its very foundations seeming to protest against their intrusion. Chloe, who had wandered into the parlor, felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The room was empty, save for a few dusty chairs and a grand piano in the corner. But it was the piano that caught her attention. It sat silently in the corner, its keys chipped and yellowed, the wood cracked from years of neglect. She was about to turn away when a faint note sounded from the piano. Her heart skipped a beat. She took a hesitant step toward it, her hand shaking as she reached out. The keys began to play on their own. Chloe froze. The melody was haunting, familiar yet foreign. like a lullaby sung by a mother to her child. She tried to back away, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The music grew louder, the tempo quickening, until the sound of the piano was drowned out by the violent crack of thunder that shook the mansion. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath her feet groaned as though the house itself was waking from a long slumber. "Chloe?" Matt called out from somewhere in the distance. Chloe wanted to answer, but the music was too loud, and she couldn't tear herself away from the piano. "Chloe!" This time, it was Erica's voice. Chloe's body jolted as if waking from a trance. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror. The music stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. "Guys, get over here now," she screamed as they rejoined her in the parlor. The temperature dropped even further. The house seemed to grow darker, and a sense of oppression hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. The three friends stood frozen, their hearts racing. The sound wasn't coming from any of them. It was too heavy, too deliberate. The stairs creaked under invisible weight, as if someone or something was climbing them. "We need to leave, now," Erica whispered, her voice trembling. But before they could move, the front door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The walls of the mansion groaned like they were alive, closing in around them. The air became thick and suffocating, and then it happened. In a flash of lightning, they all saw it. Dozens of pale, ghostly faces pressed against the shattered windows of the upper floors. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands reaching out in desperate pleas. "Who are they?" Matt whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Before anyone could answer, the house seemed to come alive. The stairs creaked again, but this time there was no mistaking it. Footsteps, invisible yet undeniable, were climbing toward them. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the walls seemed to close in around them. And then, from the pitch-black hallway to their right, a hand reached out, pale, thin, and translucent, and grabbed hold of Chloe's wrist. She screamed as the hand yanked her into the darkness. "Chloe!" Matt and Erica shouted, but their voices were swallowed by the storm. The hallway had swallowed her whole, and no matter how hard they tried to find her, Chloe was gone. Years passed. The mansion was still standing, though it had grown even more decrepit with time. People still whispered about the voices that could be heard during storms, the moans, the screams, the lullabies. But now, there was another voice, faint but unmistakable, Chloe's voice. She was no longer a missing person in the eyes of the locals. She had become another part of the mansion, another voice trapped within its walls, crying out for help. Every storm, her voice joined the others, whispering from the dark. And if you listened closely enough, you could hear her asking the same thing she had asked the night she disappeared. "Where are my friends?" The small town of Barlow had never been a place of much significance. It was the kind of town that faded into the background, nestled between vast stretches of farmland and quiet woods, where everyone knew each other and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But that was before the storm. It came out of nowhere, a thunderstorm so fierce that it rattled the windows of every house, bending trees in half and unleashing torrents of rain that seemed to have no end. The town's residents had huddled inside, hoping for it to pass. But it didn't. For 2 straight days, the storm raged with a fury they hadn't seen in years. When it finally stopped, the town was drenched, its streets filled with water that had nowhere to go. But amidst all that water, something strange appeared. A large puddle, easily twice the size of any that had formed on the streets, appeared on the corner of Maple Street and Oak Avenue. It was perfectly circular, as though carved out of the earth by something invisible. What was most unsettling, however, was not its size or its sudden appearance, but what it reflected, or rather what it didn't. The puddle did not reflect the sky above. as a normal puddle would. Instead, it reflected a vast, misty forest, shrouded in a fog so thick it obscured any real sense of direction. And deep within the fog, there seemed to be a figure, moving. It was impossible to make out its features from where anyone stood, but something about the way it moved was unnatural, almost wrong. At first, people tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a puddle, but the more they looked at it, the more they felt a gnawing unease, as though the puddle was not simply water, but a doorway to something far more sinister. That's when Kabir went missing. Kabir was 11 years old, a curious boy with a fearless nature that often got him into trouble. His older brother, Arnav, was 16, and he had always looked out for Kabir. They were close, despite their age gap, and Arnav had never minded that Kabir often dragged him into mischief. But on that fateful morning, things went horribly wrong. Arnav had been up early, doing his usual routine of checking the front porch for any signs of the storm's aftermath. He had seen the puddle the night before, but had thought little of it. The air still smelled of rain, and the streets were wet, but the storm had finally passed. Arnav glanced over at the corner of the street, and that's when he saw it again. The puddle, shimmering in the soft light of the morning sun. This time, however, something was different. Kabir was standing near the puddle, his little feet barely touching the wet ground as he leaned over, his face drawn in concentration, staring into it as though he were hypnotized. "Kabir!" Arnav called out, but his voice seemed to falter as he stepped closer. Kabir didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the puddle, and for a moment, Arnav could have sworn that Kabir's eyes weren't focused on the surface of the water. Instead, his eyes seemed to be looking through it. Then something happened. Kabir's body stiffened, his posture rigid, and before Arnav could even take another step, Kabir stepped into the puddle. "Kabir! No!" Arnav shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. Kabir vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. For a moment, Arnav stood frozen, staring at the empty space where his brother had just been. The puddle rippled, as though it were alive, the water churning in unnatural patterns. Panic surged through him, his heart racing. "Kabir!" Arnav cried, but there was no answer, no sound, nothing. His breath caught in his throat as he noticed something. The puddle shimmered again, and this time, instead of the empty reflection of the sky, he saw something, someone. It was Kabir. But it wasn't the Kabir he knew. This version of Kabir stood in the midst of that foggy forest, waving silently. His body was motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, as though he were standing still, waiting for someone. But the expression on his face, it wasn't the look of a child. It was hollow, empty, as though he had been there for far longer than any 11-year-old should be. Arnav's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer to the puddle. The air around him felt charged, heavier, as if something was drawing him in, urging him to step forward. He reached out and, without thinking, dipped a hand into the water. The cool liquid lapped at his fingers, sending a strange shiver down his spine. The moment his skin touched the surface, the world around him seemed to shift. The ground beneath his feet seemed to dissolve, and the air turned thick, suffocating. The puddle pulled him in with an unstoppable force, and before he could fight it, he was submerged, pulled under completely. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then, as if from nowhere, Arnav found himself standing in a place that was not Earth. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and mold, and the sound of raindrops was unrelenting. The rain, a constant, drenching downpour, seemed to never cease, falling in a relentless torrent from a sky too dark to make out. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a labyrinth of twisted trees and dense underbrush. But what unsettled Arnav the most wasn't the surroundings. It was the whispering, a faint sound, almost too soft to hear, but constant, a chorus of voices, speaking in unison, but not quite forming words, just whispers that seemed to crawl into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, stealing his focus. "Kabir," Arnav whispered, his voice trembling. From deep within the fog, there was movement. Kabir's figure emerged from the mist, but this time he looked different. His skin was pale, his eyes dark, and his movements were stiff, unnatural. "Kabir?" Arnav asked again, but his brother didn't respond. He only stood there, staring into the distance as though waiting for something or someone. "Kabir, it's me, Arnav. Come on, let's go home," Arnav pleaded. But Kabir remained still, his expression vacant. Arnav's heart sank. This wasn't his brother anymore. This thing in front of him wasn't Kabir. As he stepped forward, a sharp pain lanced through his chest, as if something inside him was twisting. His breath caught in his throat, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The world around him began to shift, the ground beneath him starting to tremble. The rain fell harder, the shadows growing longer, and the darkness seemed to be watching him. Then the voices finally broke through. Stay with us. Become like us," they whispered. Arnav stumbled back, shaking his head. No, I won't stay here. I won't become like you." But it was already too late. His reflection in the puddle, his own image, began to fade, replaced by something else, something darker, something twisted. The longer you stayed, the less human you became, and Arnav knew, in that moment, that he might never leave this place. Not fully, not the way he was. The rain fell, the shadows whispered, and Arnav realized with a sickening certainty that he had entered a world that would never let him go. Bhairavnagar, a quiet village nestled in the hills, wasn't the kind of place people left behind easily. Its tight-knit community, with its old stone houses and winding roads, gave a sense of comfort. But comfort was an illusion, for Bhairavnagar had its secrets, some buried deep in the earth, others lingering in the cold, unyielding rain. It was during the monsoon season that the village's legends resurfaced. The storms would roll in from the mountains, thick clouds swallowing the sky, and the rain would pour relentlessly. People knew to stay inside, to lock their doors and keep their windows tightly shut, for it was in these storms that she would appear, the bride who walks in rain. Her story was whispered from one generation to the next, a tale that was both tragic and terrifying. The village had seen her once, a ghostly figure drenched in the downpour, her veil covering her face, barefoot and silent, walking along the empty roads. No one knew her name, only that she had once been a bride, left at the altar on her wedding day, and in her despair had drowned herself in her wedding dress. Now every rainy season, she returned, seeking the same thing, company. The rules were simple, or so the legends said. If you saw her and you offered her a ride, she would accept, silent and calm. But if you ignored her, she would follow, her footsteps echoing in the rain, relentless. And every year, without fail, someone in the village went missing. Their car would be found later, always soaked through, as though it had been caught in the heaviest downpour. But there was one strange detail that the authorities could never explain. The driver's seat was always empty, but the passenger side was wet with muddy footprints leading away, disappearing into the storm. This year, it was Vinay's turn to face the legend. Vinay, a 28-year-old journalist from the city, had come to Bhairavnagar to investigate its stories, its rumors. He had heard the tale of the bride who walks in rain from an old woman in the village, and though he tried to dismiss it as a superstition, something about it intrigued him. There was something in her eyes when she spoke of the bride, a kind of fear, an understanding that made Vinay's curiosity grow stronger. The monsoon season had just begun. The rain fell heavily that night, the sound of it like a drum against the roof of his small guest house. Vinay lay in bed, unable to sleep. He had seen the storm before, but there was something different about it tonight. The air felt heavier, charged with something more than just moisture. He pulled the sheets off and glanced out the window. The wind howled through the trees, and through the mist, he saw a figure, a woman, standing by the side of the road. Her figure was hazy, almost ghost-like, obscured by the rain, but her presence was undeniable. Vinay's heart skipped a beat. He knew the story. Was this the bride? Before he could think twice, he grabbed his jacket and hurried out of the guest house, his boots splashing in the muddy water. The road was eerily empty. The village was quiet, save for the storm, the wind, and the sound of his footsteps. Vinay reached the edge of the road, where he saw her. She stood there, motionless, her back to him. A long white dress clung to her form, drenched by the rain. The veil covered her face, but her bare feet left imprints in the mud, each one deeper than the last. The legend had said that if you offered a ride, she would accept. But what if she was not real? Vinay thought. What if this was just another local tale? Without thinking, he approached her, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "Do you need help?" Vinay called out. She didn't turn, didn't even flinch. She stood there as still as stone, her presence colder than the rain itself. "Do you need a ride?" Vinay tried again, his voice trembling. The silence stretched on for what seemed like forever, until finally she moved. Slowly, almost mechanically, she turned toward him, her veil still concealing her face, her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto his. Vinay's breath caught in his throat. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Without a word, she started walking toward his car. Every step was deliberate, as though she were drawn by some invisible force. Vinay's mind raced. Was she real? Was this some elaborate prank? Or was it something more? He quickly ushered her into the passenger seat, trying to hide the shaking in his hands. She didn't speak. The rain continued to beat against the windows, a constant, rhythmic drum. The drive was long, the road winding through the mountains, the visibility poor. Vinay stole glances at her, his heart pounding. There was something unsettling about her stillness, her silence. Every now and then, her damp, cold breath fogged up the window beside her, but she didn't move, didn't speak. Minutes turned to hours, and yet Vinay couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The road stretched endlessly before him, and the rain didn't let up. Then, just as he was beginning to lose his sense of time, he heard it, a whisper, a faint sound, barely audible above the rain. "Stop!" Vinay's grip on the wheel tightened. He couldn't see her face, but he could feel her gaze on him, pressing down on him. His mouth went dry. He slowed the car, his headlights piercing through the rain, the fog growing thicker. As the car came to a halt, the air felt different, thicker. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling outside. Vinay glanced at the passenger seat. She was gone. He jumped, his heart racing, his hands shaking. The seat was empty. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the pounding of the rain on the car's roof. He opened the door and stepped out, his breath misting in the cold air. His eyes scanned the darkness, and then he saw it, a figure, barely visible through the rain, standing by the side of the road, the bride. Her back was to him again, and she was walking away, her white dress dragging behind her, her veil still hiding her face. Without thinking, Vinay rushed after her. His feet splashed in the mud as he ran, but no matter how fast he moved, the distance between them remained the same. Then suddenly, the figure stopped. She turned to face him, her face still hidden beneath her veil. The air grew colder, the storm stronger. Vinay's heart pounded in his chest. He reached out a hand, his voice trembling. "Wait!" he cried. But before he could say anything more, the world around him seemed to shift. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the storm grew louder, more violent. Vinay felt the temperature drop, his breath visible in the freezing air, and then, with a scream that was both human and otherworldly, the bride vanished, disappearing into the storm. Vinay stood there, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him returned to silence, the rain falling gently once more. He staggered back to his car, his hands trembling, the words of the missing villagers echoing in his mind. "I think I saw a woman in a bridal dress standing in the storm." The next day, Vinay was found wandering near Bhairavnagar, his car abandoned on the side of the road, soaked through. The only thing found in the passenger seat was a single muddy footprint leading into the distance. And every year, during the monsoon season, someone else would go missing, their car abandoned, the driver's seat empty, the passenger side wet, and always the same muddy footprints leading away into the storm. For in Bhairavnagar, the bride who walks in rain never stops searching. The hill station of Goliath was everything Rachel and Jason had dreamed of, a serene escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. Nestled high in the mountains, the town was a haven of quiet, mist-covered streets and quaint cottages, perfect for their honeymoon. They had arrived 3 days ago, with visions of cozy nights in front of the fire, walks through the woods, and long, lazy mornings in each other's company. The monsoon season was a welcome guest, its rains adding a rhythmic charm to the atmosphere, a constant reminder of nature's beauty. But the third night, something changed. Rachel woke with a start, a heavy stillness in the air. The rhythmic pattering of rain on the roof had stopped. Strange, because it was still pouring heavily outside. She rolled over to check the clock, but it blinked only 12 a.m., frozen in place. Jason stirred beside her, his breathing slow and steady. He had always been the heavier sleeper, and Rachel smiled as she watched him for a moment. Before the chill in the room prickled at her skin, she pulled the blanket closer, but as her eyes wandered around the room, a sudden unease crept up her spine. Something was wrong. The silence, so unnatural for a stormy night, pressed down on her chest. No distant thunder, no wind, no soft drizzle. The world outside had been swallowed by an eerie hush. She turned to Jason, nudging him gently. "Jason, wake up," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jason mumbled in his sleep, shifting a little. His eyes fluttered open, but his expression was one of confusion. "What is it?" he muttered, still groggy. "It's too quiet," Rachel said, her voice low, as if speaking louder might shatter the silence. Jason blinked a few times, his mind slowly coming into focus. "It's just the rain," he murmured, but even he seemed unsure. Staring out the window into the foggy darkness, Rachel got up, walking to the window and parting the curtains. The sight outside sent a shiver through her. The town, normally alive with the sound of rainfall, was deathly still. No movement, no signs of life. The streetlights, usually warm and comforting, flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch across the pavement. And then, as her gaze moved further down the street, she saw it, something tall, walking slowly through the fog. The figure was outlined in the mist, but its features were obscured by the rain that was no longer falling. "Jason," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Look." Jason stood up, rubbing his eyes, and joined her at the window. His face drained of color when he saw the same figure. It was walking through the fog, its silhouette unnaturally still, moving in a slow, deliberate manner. The fog curled around it like an extension of the figure itself, swirling and shifting as though it was alive. But there was something more disturbing. something that made Rachel's blood run cold. The figure was walking, but it wasn't making a sound, not even the softest footstep. The silence was so profound, so deep, it felt as though the world itself had been sucked into a void. Who is that?" Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Rachel said, backing away from the window. "But it feels wrong. Everything feels wrong." They both turned away, and Rachel reached for her phone. She tried to unlock it, but the screen flickered, a burst of static. It wasn't the normal network issues they'd experienced before. This was different. This felt intentional. "Try the TV," Rachel suggested, her voice shaking. Jason walked over to the small television on the wall and clicked the power button. The screen came to life, but instead of the usual broadcast, all that appeared was a flood of white noise and static, filling the room with a low hum. Rachel's stomach churned. "Why isn't anything working?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. Jason checked his own phone, but the static remained. The signal was dead. "Maybe we should go outside," Jason suggested, his voice strained. "Maybe we can find someone." Rachel nodded, but her feet felt heavy as she made her way to the door. The atmosphere felt oppressive, thick with the kind of tension that makes it hard to breathe. Outside, the stillness hit them like a wall. The streets were deserted, the shops locked up tight. But the silence, it was unlike anything they'd ever experienced. It was as if the world was holding its breath. As they stepped into the street, Rachel stopped abruptly. In the distance, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A cluster of people standing still in the middle of the road. They were motionless, frozen mid-step, as if trapped in a moment of time. "Jason, look!" Rachel gasped. They rushed toward the figures, and as they got closer, they saw that the people were not only frozen, they were staring blankly ahead, their faces void of emotion. A woman stood with a basket in her hands, her foot raised mid-step, but she didn't move. A man was frozen mid-wave, his arm suspended in the air. They were all stuck in this unnatural pause, their lives suspended. This isn't real," Jason muttered under his breath. "This can't be happening." Suddenly, Rachel felt something cold brush against her skin, a presence behind them. Turning slowly, her breath caught in her throat. The tall figure from before was closer now, just outside the edge of the town, moving through the fog like a shadow. Jason gripped Rachel's arm tightly. "What is that thing?" he whispered. "I don't know," Rachel replied, her voice trembling. "But we need to leave." But as they turned to run, the world around them seemed to shift. The fog thickened, swirling around them in a way that felt purposeful, as though it was chasing them, cornering them. The town had become a labyrinth of mist and silence, and every direction they tried to take only led them back to where they had started. Desperation clawed at them, and Rachel's heart raced as she realized they were trapped. She spun around, her mind reeling. "We're not in the same place anymore. This isn't the town we arrived in." Jason, wide-eyed, gripped her shoulders. "We need to get inside, now." They stumbled back to the cottage, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them, as if the house itself was locking them in. Rachel looked around, her breath shallow. The silence in the room was deafening. The walls seemed to pulse with the stillness. Jason's eyes were wild, darting from one corner of the room to another. "What the hell is happening?" Suddenly the static from the TV blared to life, and the figure appeared again on the screen. This time, its face was visible, a twisted, hollow expression, its eyes deep pools of darkness. And it spoke, its voice a deep, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot escape. Not while the veil is here." Rachel's throat tightened. "What veil?" she gasped. The silent rain. The figure continued, its lips barely moving. "A place where time fractures. A town suspended in silence until the price is paid." Jason's eyes narrowed. "What price?" The figure smiled, though it was a grotesque, unnatural thing. A soul. A sacrifice. Something to balance the stillness. Rachel's stomach churned. What happens if we don't give it up? You will remain here, the figure whispered. Trapped forever, frozen in time, like the others. Until the veil finds another to take your place. The screen flickered and went black, leaving Rachel and Jason in a suffocating silence. The air was thick with dread. They had no choice but to make a decision. Sacrifice someone, or be lost forever in a town where time had no meaning, and the rain never stopped. Rachel turned to Jason, her heart heavy. What do we do? Jason's face was pale, his mind racing. There was only one way out, but the price would be steep. I don't know, he whispered, but we have to find a way. The figure in the fog was waiting for them, and it would not be denied. The day began like any other camping trip. A group of excited high school students from Roosevelt High had loaded onto the bus with their teachers and chaperones, heading deep into the heart of the Blackwood Forest for a weekend of hiking, campfires, and the occasional ghost story around the fire. They didn't know that, by the end of the trip, none of them would be the same, or in some cases, even alive. The Blackwood Forest had always had its strange stories. People talked about the eerie sounds at night, the unexplainable shadows that lurked just outside campfires, and the dense trees that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who dared to listen. But none of the campers gave these stories much thought. They were here for fun, to escape their regular lives for a few days and bond with their classmates. By evening, the camp was set up. Tents were pitched, firewood was gathered, and the smell of roasted marshmallows filled the air. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to twinkle like tiny diamonds, scattered across a velvet sky. A full moon cast an eerie glow over the forest, and the night seemed peaceful, almost magical. But that was before it started. The wind picked up, slow at first, as if nature itself were preparing for something. Then it came, rushing through the trees, making them creak and groan under its weight. The temperature dropped in an instant, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the campfire. The chatter around the fire stopped as a strange, unsettling silence fell over the group. Out of nowhere, the sky turned a deep, violent red. At first, no one could believe it. Everyone thought it was some kind of weird sunset trick, but the red spread, consuming the sky like an infection. The wind howled louder, and within moments, the storm hit. It wasn't a normal storm. It didn't roll in gently with the usual rumblings of thunder. This one screamed, a high-pitched, unnatural wail that seemed to come from the very air itself. The trees began to bend violently, as though they were being pulled toward the ground by an invisible force. Then, it rained. The campers screamed as the first droplets hit the ground. They weren't water. No, they were thick and sticky, clinging to their skin. A foul, metallic odor filled the air, a sharp, pungent scent of iron. Blood. It wasn't just a few drops. It poured from the sky, splattering onto the ground, turning the earth into a sea of red. Panic swept through the group. Some students ducked under trees. Others rushed to their tents, trying to escape the rain of blood. But it didn't help. The blood soaked through their clothes, clinging to their skin, sticking in their hair. The forest floor became slippery, as though the ground itself was alive, feeding on the strange liquid terror that fell from above. Then a scream, not from the blood, but from something else. I saw something. Emily, a student from the back of the group, yelled, her face pale. She pointed to the ground beneath her feet. Something's moving down there. The others stopped, eyes wide with terror. The ground shifted, undulating as though something was burrowing beneath the surface. The earth trembled, sending a shudder through the entire forest. For a moment it seemed like the very woods were alive, responding to the rain in ways that defied logic. "Emily, you're just freaking out. It's the blood, that's all," Jack, one of the chaperones, called out, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could barely mask the fear in his eyes. But Emily wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the trees, her voice shaking. "My grandma. I saw her. She was standing between the trees, her face. It wasn't right. Her eyes, they were empty." The others turned to look where Emily was pointing. There, between the trees, stood a figure. A woman. Her clothes were tattered, her hair matted with the rain that soaked through her skin. But there was something wrong with her. Her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. As the campers stared, the figure began to dissolve into the red mist of the storm. It wasn't a person at all. It was a shadow, a ghost, and it was only the beginning. Then it stopped. The rain, the screaming wind, the eerie howling. The forest fell silent. But something was wrong. The ground still quivered, and the blood-soaked earth pulsed like a heartbeat. The students stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do, their eyes flicking nervously toward the tents. In the distance, a strange sound echoed through the woods. A slow, steady drip, drip, drip. The students turned to look at one of the tents. It was empty. The flap was open, and inside, a single footprint was visible. It wasn't a normal footprint, though. It pointed up, as though whoever had made it had been pulled toward the sky. The ground around it was soaked in blood, as if someone had been dragged through it. "Where's Daniel?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "Where's Daniel?" He was in that tent. No one had an answer. Daniel, one of the students, had disappeared. There was no sign of him, no trace of where he'd gone. It was as if he'd simply vanished. The night grew colder. No one slept. No one dared. The nightmare had only begun. As the storm raged on, the group huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But something had changed in the air. A weight, a dark presence, hung over them all. Every camper could feel it. There was something in the woods, something watching. Then the nightmares began. Each student, without fail, awoke in the dead of night, sweating, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. Every dream was the same. They were back in the forest. The rain was falling, thick and heavy, and they were running from something they couldn't see but felt closing in. And in the distance, the figure of their dead loved ones stood, watching them, always watching. But it wasn't just the nightmares that plagued them. One by one, the campers began to disappear. It started with Emily. She was the first. The others had woken to find her missing, a scream still echoing in their ears. No one knew what had happened, but one thing was clear. She had vanished into thin air. Then came Jack. The storm had rolled in once more, and Jack had gone to check the perimeter of the camp, but he never returned. The others heard him calling out, his voice frantic, his words barely intelligible. "It's raining again." The disappearances continued. By the time the group left the forest, only a few of them remained. They were shell-shocked, broken by what they had seen and lost. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark on them inside and out. No one spoke of the events of that night again. They couldn't. They didn't have the words. They were just kids. Kids who had come to the forest for a camping trip and had left with something far darker than any of them could ever comprehend. But the nightmares didn't stop. The dreams, the whispers, the feeling of something always watching, they never went away. And each time it rained, they could hear it. Drip, drip, drip. The sound of blood falling from the sky, and with it, the whispered warning from the past. It's raining again. Months later, the last of the campers vanished. No one knew why or where they had gone. But there were whispers among those who still remembered. Whispers about a storm, about a blood-red sky, and the dark force that had claimed them all. And somewhere, deep in the Blackwood forest, the ground still moves. The blood still falls, and the dead still watch.